Hi everyone, this is Taylor with the Daily Eden, and today we're going to talk about H.R. 7120, which is the House of Representatives and the Democrats' response to the BLM movements and all of the protests and all of that outbreak and all of that outcry. And this is how they basically are responding to all of the situation with George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and all of that terrible stuff that happened. And with that, we're just going to get right into it. First of all, this bill pushes pretty much all of the responsibility to do all of this reform onto the Attorney General. Puts a lot of responsibility on them, and obviously they're not going to do it all themselves. They're going to hire people and make boards and make a structure and all that stuff in order to handle all of this, but it pushes most of the responsibility onto the Attorney General, and you're going to hear me say it a ton, so just strap in. And so the first thing we're going to talk about is Title I, and the first part of it starts with qualified immunity, and it basically says that it's no longer a defense for a cop to say that they didn't know the laws or that the law was not established at the time. It also gives the Attorney General the ability to subpoena information should they think that civil rights were violated in any police incident or misconduct. It also establishes civilian review boards that will help police officers and internal affairs review certain police incidents and misconduct. This title also requires a review of a study done in 2015 about policing in the 20th century, and after a review of that study, the Attorney General, along with various other organizations, is going to have to make a top-to-bottom suggestion about how to reform the justice system. Now, that's a tall order, I get it. They're not going to read it, look up, and know the answer immediately, but there's a couple things in this bill that give them a little bit more guidance on how things should be done and some more stringent requirements on things that they already do to hopefully give them a little bit more structure. Now, this section also focuses on accreditation organizations. What I mean by that is a organization that accredits or says a police force is actually a police force. And if you focus on those accreditation organizations and you make it a little bit harder to be a police force, you put in some auditing techniques, which this section does, then the end result, hopefully, is better police forces, right? I thought that was a pretty good thing to focus on, not just making the current police officers go out and actually just get training and watch some videos or something like that, but focus on the organizations that actually accredit or give credit to the police forces in general at the top level. Everybody, it's a blanket. I think it's a really good thing and not to be overlooked in this bill. This section also requires that law enforcement agencies hire based on the ethnicities that they serve. So if you have a predominantly black community, then you have a predominantly black police force, or at least that's the goal. Now, there's no hard and fast rules here. They're not saying that 55% of your police force needs to be the majority of the ethnicity that you serve. Now, they do just say a blanket statement. You need to try to hire the majority ethnicity or reflect the ethnicities of your community in your police force. This section of the bill also requires the Attorney General to hand select a nationwide task force for misconduct. It's basically going to have oversight over all of the police forces in America, and then they're going to try to identify places of misconduct and point them out and bring them to light. And that's their entire job, is to identify misconduct and then make sure that people know about it, and then something is actually being done about it. And they're going to use resources like labor organizations and professional police organizations to gather their information and then report on that misconduct. It also requires the Attorney General to do a study about law enforcement oversight, particularly about how police officers can delay questions from internal affairs in order to give them a little bit more time, or maybe allow them to maybe retire or something like that. It's going to look into certain laws that allow police officers to delay their answers to internal affairs to hopefully get a little bit more transparency into misconduct and things like that without letting them slip through their fingers. This section also introduces a new reporting requirement basically on any police interaction that happens ever, from things like traffic stops to stop and frisk, all the way up to use of deadly force or use of excessive force, things like that. The race, age, ethnicity, all the information of the police officer and the type of incident that happened will have to be taken down, and then it's submitted to a huge database. So then we can look at it and analyze, are certain types of police officers more inclined to get into certain types of situations, or maybe there's nothing at all to draw from it, but at least we'll have the information. We can look at it and say, this is what happened. Title 2 of this act is entitled Policing Transparency Through Data, and the first part of Title 2 is about establishing a misconduct registry. Now, the information that goes in the misconduct registry are complaints against officers, discipline records, termination records, lawsuit records, certification records, and whether or not that police officer was under investigation during their time of retirement. At the federal level, they will have to report this data within 6 months of the enactment of this act, and then annually forever. At the state and local level, they'll have to report every 180 days. This information will be available to the public in an internet form, and if state and local level and federal agencies do not comply with this requirement, then they lose funding. Part 2 of Title 2 establishes a new reporting requirement for law enforcement agencies, and that report is going to have to include incidents of use of deadly force, incidents where a civilian shot a police officer, it specifically says shot, incidents where a police officer was arrested or is dead, deaths in custody, and use of force during an arrest. Now, if this annual report is not generated and submitted to the Attorney General, that law enforcement agency will lose 10% of its funding. Title 3 is entitled Improving Police Training and Policies, and it starts out by just blatantly saying we're prohibiting racial profiling. Now, that's one thing to say it. Now, how do they enact it? And the way that they do that is actually giving a lot of power to civilians. If a police officer cannot bring forth a good reason to stop someone, credible evidence, then that person can claim that it was because of racial profiling and have everything thrown out. The Attorney General will put into place a system that will audit policies at law enforcement agencies about racial profiling, and if they get an unfavorable opinion in that audit, there's potential that those police agencies could lose funding. The Attorney General will also award contracts and grants to certain organizations to study hit rates, and what a hit is, or what hit rate is whether or not a police officer stops somebody and actually finds some kind of contraband. Now, what that study is going to include is the gender, race, age of that police officer, and their hit rate. Now, this is not going to have any kind of identifying information in it, but it will be just an aggregate of raw data to look at what hit rate is versus what type of gender or what age or what race, and that's just good information to have. This title of the bill bans no-knock warrants in drug cases only. It understands the need for no-knock warrants, but in drug cases specifically, there are no more no-knock warrants. It also bans chokeholds completely. If a police agency does not have policies banning chokeholds, they lose funding. Now, it also would require that police officers notify people when they're about to use force. If problems persist, they will use force. It also comes up with a schedule or charges the Attorney General with the requirement of coming up with a schedule of when to use force and how much to use. Obviously, it's going to be a little bit gray. There's no clear cut, this is exactly what you do in this exact situation, but it actually has a plan for how much force to use in certain situations if force is necessary at all. It also takes away a police officer's defense to use force if their negligence led up to that use of force. The next thing in this bill is about basically demilitarizing the police. There's a program that goes on between the Department of Defense and Department of Justice where excess material from the Department of Defense is converted over to the Department of Justice so they can use it. I get it, you don't want to waste stuff, but what this bill would do is it would restrict a lot of that transfer. Things like guns, ammunition, huge vehicles, just basically things that the police don't need. A lot of militarized guns, things that are considered military grade that the police don't need, would be taken away, and that transfer would be taken away. And if there's a policy not in place and 100% accountability for all of the stuff that's transferred from the Department of Defense to the Department of Justice, that police agency will lose their right to transfer any more material over to their department. The last half of Title 3 has to do with body cameras, and it requires all cops to wear body cameras with audio during any type of interaction with a civilian. Now, that's when they're going to arrest somebody. They have to have their body camera on. Now, there are a couple situations where the bill allows for the body camera to be turned off. The first one is if they're entering a private residence and the resident has said, I don't want you to film this residence. Or they're walking up to somebody where an apparent crime has happened and the person that the crime has happened to wants them to turn the body camera off. Or that the police officer has someone approach them to anonymously report a crime, and the person obviously wants to remain anonymous. The police officer can turn their body camera off. Now, in all three of these instances, the police officer has to record themselves with the audio, asking if they would like the body camera to be turned off. Obviously, if you're approaching somebody and something horrible has happened to them and an apparent crime has happened to this person and they're sobbing, you're not going to lead with, I have a body camera on, do you want me to turn it off? This bill takes that into consideration, and it says at the earliest convenience or when it seems right, the police officer should ask the person if they want to be filmed or if they want the body camera to be turned off. All footage from body cameras has to be kept for a minimum of 6 months, and if that certain footage is under investigation from any type of allegation against a police officer or any type of lawsuit, anything like that, then that body camera footage has to be kept for a minimum of 3 years. Now, if some type of rule for this body camera, like if a police officer turns it off at any point in time during any type of altercation or interaction, that is no longer can be used as evidence against the person that is being arrested for a certain crime. Title 3 also has rules about cameras in squad cars, and that is that every squad car has to have a camera in it. These cameras have to be able to record up to 10 hours straight of video, and they have to be activated when a police officer activates the lights on their squad car. Also, no facial recognition software can be used with these squad car cameras at all. And these squad car camera footage will only be kept for 90 days. The last title on this bill I'm going to talk about is Title 4, and that is closing the consent loophole. And that is whenever an officer arrests somebody, there can be no sexual act happen between the officer and the person that is arrested, even if that person gives consent to the officer. There is absolutely no way, in no form, supposed to be any kind of sexual contact between a police officer who's acting under the color of law and the person that they are arresting or investigating. Nothing. There's some good stuff and some bad stuff, and we'll start with the good stuff. First of all, I like that they have the community involvement through the civilian review boards of certain police misconduct. Also, I like that they go after the funding of the police officers and not necessarily say that we're going to take it all, but you have to do these couple things, these couple honestly commonsensical things in these reporting requirements in order to receive your funding, because that's the only way to incentivize a law enforcement agency to do anything: funding. I also like all the stringent requirements on training. There's a lot of intervening training, a lot of de-escalation training, a lot of training on racial bias and racial profiling, a lot of that stuff. I like the training and the focus on training that they actually implemented in this bill. I also like that there's going to be guidance on use of force, or at least there's a plan to come up with guidance for the use of force. I don't know if that necessarily exists right now. If so, it's not very prevalent in the training that I see, but then again, I don't know everything, and I'm definitely not a cop, but I do like that they're going to at least provide guidance to police officers on the way that they can use force during certain situations. I also like the implementation of body cameras. They are requiring everybody to use a body camera. Everybody benefits from body cameras, audio and video. It's something that should have been done a long time ago, and something that honestly should pass no problem. If this thing gets held up, we should immediately enact a body camera act, in my opinion, and make sure that all police officers are wearing body cameras at all times during every interaction with civilians. That's my personal opinion. I think that goes best for both ways, both civilians and police officers. And I also like that they're implementing squad car cameras too, because honestly, body cameras can maybe malfunction or something, but you have a backup now with your squad car camera. It's all really good stuff that they're doing with the cameras, and as far as documentation of interactions with civilians, I think that's a really good thing. Now for the bad stuff, and the first one, it's a little nitpicky, but I read the bill and it bugged me, and they used the words less lethal force all over the bill. Now, if you don't immediately see the problem with that, There is no such thing as less lethal. If you're less lethal, you're still lethal. It makes no sense. Non-lethal makes sense, and I would hope that somebody would go back and read this and actually change every part that they put less lethal and say non-lethal force, because it just makes no sense to call something less lethal. The last bad thing I have is that their no-knock warrant clauses are a little lacking. Yes, it's good to ban them in certain situations, but you also should be reporting on no-knock warrants, in my opinion. Any no-knock warrant that gets issued should be written down or recorded in some way. Maybe it already is, but in some of the other bills that I read, specifically the other response to the BLM and the protests and everything from the Senate, they have no-knock warrant reporting clauses, and I thought that was really good, and I think it's something that this bill could use. That's all for this video. Remember to get out there, tweet at representatives, tweet at your senators, let them know how you feel. This is, once again, an extremely important part of American history. We can make a decision right now to make a huge change, so make sure you're getting out there and letting people know exactly what you think about what our legislators are doing. As always, like, follow, subscribe. I really appreciate it, and have a good one.